I heard my son plotting to destroy me through my grandson's forgotten Zoom call. Wednesday, March 8th, 2:17 p.m. while I sat in the kitchen of the house I'd built with my own hands 43 years ago, eating a ham sandwich and watching the rain streak down windows that still carried the fingerprints of the grandchildren David claimed I was too senile to remember. What you're about to hear isn't just about corporate betrayal, it's about forgery, embezzlement, and how a grandfather's love for technology he'd never mastered became the key that unlocked everything. The laptop had been Tommy's idea. My 8-year-old grandson David's boy had insisted I needed to get with the times during his last visit. Grandpa Bob, he'd said with the patience only children possess when teaching adults obvious things, "You can't run a construction company from just your truck anymore. You need Zoom." So I'd bought the damn thing, a silver MacBook that cost more than my first car, and let Tommy show me how to click the blue camera icon that connected me to a world I'd spent 68 years successfully avoiding. Video calls with subcontractors, virtual meetings with suppliers, even a disastrous attempt at something called a webinar about workplace safety. The rain hammered against the kitchen window with the kind of persistence that reminded me of bill collectors. I'd built Brennan Construction from nothing: one truck, one employee, and a willingness to work 16-hour days until my hands bled and my back screamed. Now we employed 237 people, owned equipment worth $8 million, and had contracts stretching from here to Nashville. The laptop sat open on the kitchen table, its screen dark, except for a small green light that Tommy had told me meant the camera was sleeping. I'd been trying to review the Henderson Project files when the screen suddenly flickered to life, filled with voices I recognized but had never heard speak with such calculated coldness. Dad's getting worse." David's voice came through the speakers with crystal clarity. He was somewhere else, his office probably, but the technology made it feel like he was sitting across from me at the same table where I'd taught him to read blueprints when he was 12. I froze with the sandwich halfway to my mouth. The screen showed David's conference room, the one with the glass walls that looked out over the shop floor where my crews prepped equipment every morning. David sat at the head of the table in the chair I'd bought him for his 30th birthday, wearing the confident expression he'd inherited from his mother and the three-piece suit that made him look like every slick corporate lawyer I'd ever fought against. "Robert, we need specifics." The second voice belonged to Marcus Webb, my business partner for the past 15 years, a man I'd trusted with my company's finances, my family's future, and apparently my own destruction. Marcus had the kind of smooth voice that made clients trust him instantly, the same voice that was now discussing my mental capacity like I was a broken piece of equipment. I set down the sandwich carefully, my appetite disappearing like smoke. The smart thing would have been to announce myself, to let them know I could hear every word. Instead, I reached over and turned up the volume, my fingers trembling slightly against the unfamiliar controls. "He's been making mistakes." David continued shuffling through papers with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation. "Last week, he signed off on the Morrison contract for 40% less than our usual markup. The week before that, he approved overtime for the entire crew when we'd specifically agreed to cut labor costs. Mistakes." I stared at the screen, watching my son reduce 40 years of business expertise to a series of errors. The Morrison contract had been a strategic decision, taking a smaller profit margin to secure a long-term relationship with their development company. The overtime had been necessary because David had scheduled 3 jobs simultaneously without consulting me about crew availability. "The board is getting nervous." Marcus said, his fingers drumming against the conference table in a rhythm I recognized from countless legitimate meetings. "They're starting to ask questions about Bob's decision-making process." The board. 3 men I'd handpicked to help guide the company's growth, all of whom owed their positions to my judgment and my willingness to share power. Now they were apparently questioning whether I deserved to keep it. "Hey, which brings us to the competency hearing." David said, and my blood turned to ice water. Dr. Hartwell says the paperwork can be filed within the week. Early-stage dementia difficulty with complex financial decisions, the usual progression. Dr. Hartwell. My family physician for the past 20 years, a man who treated everything from my torn rotator cuff to my high blood pressure. A man I'd trusted with my health who was now apparently willing to diagnose mental incompetence I didn't have. And the power of attorney transfer, Marcus asked, already drafted. Once the hearing goes through, I'll have full legal authority over all company decisions. Dad can stay involved in a consulting capacity, of course, but all major contracts, all financial decisions, all hiring and firing will go through me. Consulting capacity. Like I was some retired old-timer they were humoring instead of the man who'd built the company they were stealing. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after 40 years of climbing scaffolding and crawling through construction sites. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in like the cab of the first truck I'd ever owned. Through the window I could see the Brennan construction yard and the distant rows of equipment, stacks of materials, the office building I'd designed myself to look like something that belonged in this working-class neighborhood. "What about the Henderson project?" David asked, and I felt my chest tighten. The Henderson project was our biggest contract in 5 years, a mixed-use development that would cement our reputation and set us up for expansion into commercial real estate. Already transferred to the subsidiary, Marcus replied. Brennan Development LLC with you as the primary signatory. Your father's name isn't on any of the paperwork. Brennan Development LLC. I'd never heard of it, which meant they'd created an entire company using my family name without my knowledge. The Henderson project, the contract I'd spent 6 months negotiating, the relationship I'd built through golf games and dinner meetings, and the kind of personal touch that distinguished us from the corporate giants had been stolen while I was learning to use video conferencing software. In the loan applications he submitted yesterday, $2 million for equipment upgrades, another $1 million for the Henderson project startup costs. The bank approved both with the understanding that David Brennan is now the primary decision-maker for all company operations. $3 million. Borrowed against assets I'd spent 40 years accumulating with my son's signature instead of mine. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles went white, feeling the same surge of protective rage I'd felt the first time someone had tried to cheat me out of a legitimate payment. Dad doesn't suspect anything, Marcus asked. David laughed, and the sound cut through me like a circular saw hitting a nail. He can barely figure out how to use the laptop Tommy gave him. Yesterday I found him trying to print an email by holding his phone up to the printer. The man who used to read 50-page contracts like bedtime stories can't remember how to log into his own company's website. It was true, and that made it worse. I had struggled with the technology, had asked for help with things that seemed obvious to everyone else. But struggling with computers wasn't the same as losing my mind, and David knew it. When do we move forward with the final transfer? Marcus asked. Next week. Once the competency hearing is complete and the power of attorney is in place, we dissolve the original corporation and transfer all assets to Brennan Development. Dad becomes a shareholder with no voting rights, and we become the sole operators of what used to be his company. I sank back into the kitchen chair, feeling the weight of 68 years pressing down on my shoulders. They weren't just stealing my business, they were erasing me from my own life's work, turning me into a spectator at my own destruction. The Zoom call continued for another 10 minutes, covering details that made my stomach churn. Forged signatures on incorporation papers, backdated medical evaluations, a carefully orchestrated campaign to convince everyone who mattered that Robert Brennan was no longer competent to run Robert Brennan's company. When the call finally ended, the laptop screen went dark, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the sound of rain and the taste of betrayal. I sat there for a long time, staring at the reflection of my own face in the black screen. The man looking back at me had gray hair and deep lines around his eyes, but his mind was sharp as the day he'd first picked up a hammer. David had made one crucial mistake in his assessment of his old man's capabilities. Yes, I struggled with technology. Yes, I preferred handshake deals to digital contracts. But I hadn't survived 40 years in construction by being naive about human nature. I'd built this company by outworking, outthinking, and outmaneuvering men who thought they were smarter than the guy who showed up in work boots instead of wingtips. David and Marcus were about to learn something that every failed competitor had learned before them. Robert Brennan didn't go down easy. I closed the laptop gently the way Tommy had taught me, and walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept the business cards that had accumulated over 4 decades of networking. Somewhere in that stack was the card of Janet Morrison, the forensic accountant who'd helped me catch an embezzling bookkeeper 8 years ago. It was time to find out exactly how deep this betrayal went, and exactly how much evidence I'd need to bury the people who thought they'd already buried me. The rain was still falling, but I wasn't listening to it anymore. I was listening to the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and strong and absolutely furious. They'd declared war on the wrong old man. Janet Morrison's office smelled like coffee and suspicion. 2 things I'd grown comfortable with over the past 40 years of business. She sat across from me in a chair that had seen better decades, her gray hair pulled back in a bun that suggested she didn't have time for nonsense. At 62, Janet had the kind of sharp eyes that could spot discrepancies in a balance sheet from across a room, which was exactly what I needed. "Bob, I have to ask," she said, spreading the documents I'd brought across her desk like evidence at a crime scene. "How long has this been going on?" I'd spent 3 sleepless nights gathering papers, bank statements, incorporation documents, loan applications I'd never seen before. The pile represented everything David and Marcus thought I was too senile to understand. They were wrong about that, just like they were wrong about a lot of things. "I best I can figure about 18 months. I replied, watching her examine a signature that looked like mine but felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain. "Started right after David got married. Sarah's got expensive tastes and David's got expensive dreams. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, 28 years old with a business degree and the kind of ambition that made her eyes light up when she talked about growth opportunities and market expansion. I'd liked her confidence at first, thought it would be good for David to have a wife who challenged him. Now I wondered if she'd been the one challenging him to steal from me. Bob, this signature here." "Shoom." Janet tapped a loan application with her pen. "It's good, really good. If I didn't know you personally, I'd swear you signed this yourself." I leaned forward, studying the careful loops and curves that spelled out my name. "But I didn't. I know. Because you would have called me before taking out a $3 million loan. You're many things, Robert Brennan, but impulsive isn't one of them." She was right. In 40 years of business, I'd never made a major financial decision without sleeping on it at least twice. The loan application was dated 3 weeks ago, the same day I'd been in the hospital getting my annual physical. The same physical where Dr. Hartwell had supposedly noticed signs of cognitive decline. "Janet, I need to know how deep this goes. Every document, every signature, every dollar that's been moved without my knowledge." She nodded, already reaching for her laptop. "This is going to take time, Bob, and it's going to cost money. I've got both." What I didn't tell her was that I'd opened a new bank account at First Tennessee, one that David didn't know about, and transferred enough money to fund a small war. If my son wanted to play corporate games, he was about to learn that his old man still had a few moves left. The investigation took 2 weeks. Janet worked with the efficiency of someone who'd seen every form of financial betrayal imaginable, peeling back layers of deception like an archaeologist uncovering ancient crimes. What she found made my blood boil and my heart break in equal measure. The Brennan Development LLC had been incorporated 14 months ago with David as president and Marcus as CFO. They'd used my social security number to establish credit, my business relationships to secure contracts, and my reputation to guarantee loans. But the most damaging discovery came from a source I hadn't expected: my own grandson. Tommy had been playing on David's work computer 3 weeks earlier, trying to access a game website when he'd accidentally opened an email that made him curious enough to call me. In the way only 8-year-olds can, he'd memorized the entire message and recited it to me over chocolate chip cookies in my kitchen. Grandpa Bob, what does liquidate assets mean?" The email had been from Sarah to David discussing their plan to sell off Brennan Construction's equipment. Once the power of attorney was finalized, they weren't just stealing my company, they were planning to strip it bare and disappear, leaving 237 employees without jobs and me without anything to show for 40 years of work. "Janet," I said, setting down the report she'd prepared, "I need you to do something else. I need you to audit David's personal finances." She raised an eyebrow. "That's going to be harder. I'll need probable cause for a court order." "What if I told you I suspected he'd been embezzling from the company for the past 2 years? It wasn't suspicion anymore. Tommy's innocent revelation had led me to examine David's expense reports more carefully, and what I'd found was a pattern of personal purchases charged to company accounts. Sarah's engagement ring, $15,000 listed as office equipment. Their honeymoon in Europe, $8,000 categorized as a business conference. Even their new BMW, $45,000 somehow justified as a company vehicle despite never being used for business. Hey Bob, if you're right about this, we're not just talking about power of attorney fraud. We're talking about felony embezzlement. 3 days later, Janet called with news that made me wish I'd never started digging. David and Marcus hadn't just been stealing from me, they'd been positioning themselves to steal from everyone. The Henderson project, my biggest contract, was structured so that all profits would flow to Brennan Development, while all liabilities remained with the original company. If anything went wrong, I'd be left holding millions in debt while they walked away clean. But the worst discovery came from Dr. Hartwell's office. Janet had convinced a nurse she knew to examine my medical records, and what they found was a systematic falsification of my cognitive assessments. Test results had been altered. Diagnoses had been fabricated, and medication prescriptions had been forged, all to build a paper trail proving my mental incompetence. "Bob, they drugged you," Janet said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Those blood pressure pills you've been taking, they're not blood pressure medication. They're anti-anxiety drugs, the kind that cause confusion and memory problems in elderly patients." I stared at the prescription bottle I'd brought from home, the little white pills I'd been taking faithfully for 6 months. No wonder I'd been feeling foggy lately, struggling with tasks that should have been simple. David hadn't just been planning to steal my company, he'd been systematically poisoning me to justify it. "Well, what do I do now?" Janet leaned back in her chair, her expression grim but determined. "Now we set a trap. The key to any successful construction project is timing. You pour the foundation when the weather's right, frame the walls when the lumber's dry, and finish the roof before the rain comes. Building a case against your own son requires the same kind of patience, the same attention to detail, and the same willingness to work with materials that might crumble if you push too hard. I started by changing my behavior just enough to make David confident but not suspicious. I began asking more questions about company operations, the kind of confused, repetitive questions that reinforced his belief in my declining mental state. But I also started making small mistakes, signing documents without reading them carefully, approving expenditures that seemed excessive, delegating decisions I would normally handle myself. "Hey, Dad, you seem tired lately," David said one morning as I pretended to struggle with the coffee maker in the company break room. He'd started showing up to the office more frequently, hovering over my shoulder like a vulture waiting for roadkill to stop moving. "Just getting old, I guess," I replied, letting my voice carry the weight of defeat I didn't feel. "All this technology, all these new procedures. Sometimes I wonder if it's time to step back and let younger minds take over." David's eyes lit up with barely concealed triumph. You know, Dad, if you ever want to talk about succession planning, I've been doing some research. There are ways to structure these transitions that benefit everyone. I nodded slowly as if the idea had never occurred to me. Maybe we should set up a meeting. Get Marcus involved, maybe some of the board members. Make sure everything's done properly. That's a great idea. I'll arrange something for next week. What David didn't know was that I'd already arranged something for next week. Janet had connected me with a white-collar crime specialist from the FBI named Agent Sarah Chen, a woman who'd built her career prosecuting corporate fraud cases. She'd been very interested in the evidence we'd compiled, particularly the forged medical records and the systematic embezzlement. Mr. Brennan, Agent Chen, had said during our meeting in a downtown coffee shop that felt like a scene from a spy movie. What you're describing is a complex pattern of elder abuse, corporate fraud, and conspiracy. But proving it in court will require catching them in the act. What kind of act? We need them to incriminate themselves. Ideally, we need recorded confessions, documented attempts to force you into signing over power of attorney evidence of their plans to liquidate company assets. Which brought me to the most difficult part of the plan I had, to let them think they were winning. The meeting David arranged took place in the Brennan Construction Conference Room on a Tuesday morning in April. The same room where I'd made every major decision for the past 15 years, where I'd hired and fired, planned and built, succeeded and occasionally failed. Now it was the stage for my own corporate funeral. David sat at the head of the table, flanked by Marcus and Dr. Hartwell. The board members, Jim Patterson, Mike O'Brien, and Tom Walsh, occupied the opposite side, their expressions carefully neutral. All of them men I'd trusted, men who'd benefited from my success, men who were now prepared to declare me unfit to run my own company. What none of them knew was that Janet Morrison sat in the next room monitoring the conversation through the same video conferencing software that had accidentally exposed their plot. Agent Chen was listening from an FBI van parked across the street, ready to intervene if the situation became dangerous. You know, Dad. David began, his voice carrying the patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. We're all concerned about some of the decisions you've been making lately. The board has asked Dr. Hartwell to explain the medical situation. Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat, consulting a file that contained fabricated test results and forged assessments. Bob, I've been monitoring your cognitive function for the past 6 months, and I'm afraid the tests indicate significant decline. Memory problems, difficulty with complex decision-making, periods of confusion, all consistent with early-stage dementia. I let my shoulders slump slightly, playing the role of a confused old man receiving devastating news. Dementia. But I feel fine. I mean, I get tired sometimes, but the medication I prescribed should help with the anxiety, Dr. Hartwell continued. But I'm afraid this condition is progressive. It's going to get worse. What does that mean for the company? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Marcus leaned forward, his expression a masterpiece of false concern. Bob, we think it would be best if David took over day-to-day operations. You'd still be involved, of course, but all major decisions would go through him. It's really for everyone's protection. The legal papers are already drawn up. David added, sliding a folder across the table. Power of attorney, updated corporate structure, everything you need to ensure the company continues to thrive. I opened the folder slowly, pretending to read documents I'd already studied with Janet. The power of attorney was comprehensive, giving David control over not just the company, but my personal finances, my medical decisions, even my living arrangements. If I signed these papers, I'd be signing away my entire life. This is a lot to process, I said finally. Can I think about it for a few days? Dad. David's voice took on an edge of impatience. The longer we wait, the more unstable the company becomes. Clients are already asking questions about leadership continuity. We need to move forward quickly. I looked around the table at faces I'd known for years, men who'd shared barbecues and birthdays, holidays, and hardships. Now they were conspirators in my destruction, united by greed and the assumption that I was too weak to fight back. "There's something else," Marcus said, pulling out a second folder. "The Henderson project requires immediate attention. There are deadlines we can't miss, decisions that can't be delayed. If we don't act now, we could lose the contract entirely." The Henderson project. My project, the crown jewel of everything I'd built, being used as leverage to force my surrender. I felt anger rising in my chest, but I pushed it down, maintaining the facade of confused compliance. "I understand," I said, reaching for the pen David had placed beside the documents. "If you all think this is best." "We do, Dad, we really do." I held the pen above the signature line, letting the moment stretch until the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Then I set the pen down and looked directly at David. "Son, there's just one thing I need to know before I sign." "What's that?" "How long have you been planning to steal my company?" The silence that followed was profound. David's face went white. Marcus shifted in his chair, and Dr. Hartwell suddenly found his medical files fascinating. The board members looked confused, uncertain whether they were witnessing a medical episode or something far more serious. "Dad, I don't know what you mean." "I mean the Zoom call where you discussed my mental competency hearing. I mean the forged loan applications and the fake medical records. I mean the Brennan Development LLC that you incorporated using my social security number without my knowledge." David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You're confused. The medication is affecting your thinking. The medication that Dr. Hartwell prescribed to make me confused." I turned to face the doctor who'd betrayed 40 years of trust. "Anti-anxiety drugs disguised as blood pressure medication. Did David pay you in cash, or was it just a promise of future business?" Dr. Hartwell stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Bob, you're having an episode. These paranoid delusions are part of the disease progression. The only disease in this room is greed." I opened my briefcase and pulled out Janet's report, spreading the pages across the conference table like a royal flush. "Bank records, forged signatures, embezzlement, documentation, medical fraud, everything you've done for the past 18 months. Marcus tried to maintain control of the situation. "Bob, even if there have been some irregularities, they were all in the company's best interest. David was trying to protect. David was trying to steal. From me, from the company, from every employee who depends on us for their livelihood." I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 68 years and the strength of 40 years of honest work. "Did you really think I was too stupid to figure it out?" "You can't prove any of this," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, he can." Agent Chen's voice came from the conference room doorway, accompanied by 2 other federal agents. "FBI, Mr. David Brennan, Mr. Marcus Webb, Dr. Harold Hartwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and embezzlement." The room erupted in chaos. David tried to run but found his path blocked by Agent Chen. Marcus began frantically shuffling papers as if he could hide evidence that had already been copied and analyzed. Dr. Hartwell sat down heavily, his face the color of old concrete. "You have the right to remain silent." Agent Chen continued producing handcuffs with practiced efficiency. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The arraignment took place on a Thursday morning that felt like Christmas and a funeral combined into one surreal experience. I sat in the gallery of the federal courthouse watching 3 men I'd trusted with my life and livelihood stand before a judge who looked like she'd seen every form of human greed imaginable. David wore an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look sallow, his hands cuffed behind his back in a way that eliminated any trace of the corporate confidence he'd displayed just days earlier. Marcus stood beside him, his expensive suit replaced with prison-issued clothing that fit poorly and emphasized how small he looked without his office and his lies to prop him up. Dr. Hartwell trembled slightly as the charges were read, probably realizing that a medical license was easier to lose than to regain. The defendants are charged with conspiracy to commit elder abuse, wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, and practicing medicine under false pretenses. The prosecutor announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd sent white-collar criminals to federal prison for 15 years. Agent Chen had explained the charges to me during our preparation meetings. Elder abuse because they'd systematically undermined my mental capacity for financial gain. Wire fraud because they'd used electronic communications to perpetrate their scheme. Mail fraud because they'd used the postal service to file forged documents. Embezzlement because they'd stolen company funds for personal use. And medical fraud because Dr. Hartwell had knowingly provided false diagnoses to support their conspiracy. Each charge carried significant prison time. David and Marcus were looking at 15 to 20 years. Dr. Hartwell faced medical license revocation and up to 10 years in federal prison. Sarah, David's wife, had been arrested separately on charges of conspiracy and money laundering after investigators discovered she'd been moving stolen funds through a network of shell corporations. Your Honor. David's attorney said, a young public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. My client maintains his innocence and requests bail consideration based on his community ties and lack of prior criminal history. The judge looked over her glasses at David with the expression of someone who'd heard this argument countless times. Mr. Brennan, the evidence presented suggests a sophisticated, premeditated scheme to defraud your father of millions of dollars while simultaneously undermining his mental health through involuntary medication. Bail is denied. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness watching David's shoulders slump as he absorbed the reality of his situation. This was my son, the boy I'd taught to use a hammer, the young man I'd trusted with my life's work. But he'd made his choices, and choices had consequences. After the arraignment, I met with the prosecutor and Agent Chen to discuss the recovery of assets and the restoration of company operations. The FBI had frozen all accounts associated with Brennan Development LLC, but untangling the financial web David and Marcus had woven would take months. Mr. Brennan. The prosecutor said, we estimate that your son and his conspirators stole approximately $1.2 million in company funds and fraudulently obtained loans totaling $3.8 million. Full recovery isn't guaranteed, but we're optimistic about reclaiming most of the assets. The money was important, but it wasn't the only thing that mattered. What about the employees? What about the contracts? The Henderson project has been secured under the original company structure. Your contracts remain valid and your business licenses are unaffected. Essentially, you're back in complete control of Brennan Construction. Complete control. It was what I'd always had, what I'd never planned to give up, but hearing it officially confirmed felt like breathing freely for the first time in months. I was 71 years old and I was still the boss. The media attention was intense but brief. Local news stations ran stories about the construction company conspiracy, and the Business Journal published an analysis of elder abuse in family-owned businesses. I gave one interview to a reporter who understood that the real story wasn't about money. It was about trust, family, and the assumption that age equals vulnerability. Mr. Brennan, she asked during our conversation in the Brennan Construction office, what made you suspicious of your son's motives? Honestly, he underestimated me. He thought that because I struggled with computers and modern technology, my brain wasn't working properly. But there's a difference between not knowing how to use an iPhone and not knowing when someone's trying to steal from you. What's next for you and the company? I looked out the window at the construction yard where crews were loading equipment for the Henderson project, the same project David had tried to steal. The workers moved with the efficiency of people who knew their jobs were secure, their futures protected by someone who understood the difference between leadership and ownership. If we build, I said simply, we've got contracts to fulfill, employees to support, and a reputation to maintain. David's betrayal doesn't change any of that, but it did change everything else. The boardroom where I'd been ambushed was now being used for storage. I'd fired all 3 board members who'd participated in the conspiracy and replaced them with people I'd known since before David was born. Men and women who remembered when loyalty meant something. The investigation had revealed that 2 other board members, Jim Patterson and Tom Walsh, had been completely unaware of the conspiracy. They'd been manipulated just like I had fed false information about my mental state and convinced that David's takeover was legitimate succession planning. Mike O'Brien, however, had been receiving payments from Marcus in exchange for his support. He was facing separate charges for bribery and conspiracy. Tommy visited me the weekend after the arrests, his 8-year-old mind struggling to understand why his father was in jail. I found him in the office, sitting in David's old chair, spinning slowly with the kind of listless energy that comes from confusion. "Grandpa Bob," he said, "did my dad really steal from you?" It was the hardest question I'd ever been asked. How do you explain to a child that his father is a criminal without destroying his faith in family and trust in the basic assumption that parents protect their children instead of betraying their own fathers? "Your dad made some very bad choices," I said, sitting down across from him in the chair I'd occupied for 40 years. "He wanted things he couldn't afford, and he decided to take them instead of earning them. Is he going to jail for a long time?" "Probably." Tommy nodded, slowly processing information that no child should have to understand. "What about me? Where will I live?" Sarah's arrest had left Tommy temporarily in the custody of her parents, people I barely knew, but who seemed genuinely shocked by their daughter's criminal behavior. The custody arrangement was temporary, subject to court approval and social services review. "That's going to be decided by people who know more about these things than I do," I said. "But I can promise you that no matter what happens, you'll always have a place here. This company, this office, this family, it belongs to you too. Even though my dad tried to steal it, your dad's choices don't define you, Tommy. You get to make your own choices, and I hope you'll choose to be better than he was." 3 months later, I stood in the same courthouse where David had been denied bail, this time for a custody hearing that would determine Tommy's future. Sarah's parents had petitioned for guardianship, arguing that my age made me unsuitable as a caretaker for an 8-year-old boy. They weren't wrong about my age, but they were wrong about my capacity. The same competency evaluation that had exposed Dr. Hartwell's fraud had also established my mental acuity beyond any reasonable doubt. The judge awarded me temporary custody with the understanding that permanent arrangements would depend on Tommy's adjustment and my ability to provide appropriate care. That night, Tommy helped me make dinner in the kitchen where I'd first heard about the conspiracy to destroy me. He stood on a step stool stirring macaroni while I browned ground beef for the kind of simple meal that had sustained me through 40 years of 12-hour workdays. "Grandpa Bob," he said, "are you going to teach me about construction? If you want to learn." "I do. But I also want to learn about computers, the right way, not the way Dad did it." I smiled, feeling something inside my chest loosen for the first time since David's arrest. "We'll learn together. Deal?" Deal. 2 years after David's conviction, I stood in the conference room of the newly expanded Brennan Construction headquarters, watching Tommy demonstrate his latest computer project to a room full of adults who understood that this 10-year-old boy represented the future of everything I'd built. The presentation was simple but sophisticated, a digital inventory system that tracked equipment location, maintenance schedules, and operator certifications in real time. Tommy had designed it himself using programming skills he'd learned from online tutorials and weekend classes at the community college. "Grandpa Bob always says that organization prevents problems," Tommy explained to the assembled group of managers, supervisors, and clients. "So I built this system to help us stay organized. Every piece of equipment has a QR code that updates its status automatically." The audience was impressed, but I was proud. Not just of Tommy's technical abilities, but of his understanding that technology should serve people, not replace them. It was a lesson David had never learned, the difference between using tools and being used by them. The past 2 years had transformed both the company and our family in ways I couldn't have imagined. David was serving a 12-year sentence in federal prison, eligible for parole in 8 years with good behavior. Marcus had received 15 years, his sentence enhanced by his role as the scheme's financial architect. Dr. Hartwell had lost his medical license and received 7 years, though his cooperation with investigators had helped uncover similar fraud schemes in 3 other states. Sarah had plea bargained down to 5 years in exchange for testimony that helped prosecutors trace the movement of stolen funds through her shell corporation network. The courts had terminated her parental rights, making Tommy's custody arrangement with me permanent. Her parents maintained visitation rights, but Tommy had expressed little interest in spending time with people who'd tried to argue that he'd be better off without his grandfather. Mr. Brennan said, "Helen Martinez, our newest client. Your grandson's system could revolutionize project management for companies our size. Have you considered licensing the software to other construction firms?" I looked at Tommy, who was fielding technical questions with the confidence of someone who understood his subject completely. At 10 years old, he was already thinking about problems I'd never considered, approaching challenges with tools I'd never imagined using. "That's Tommy's decision," I said. "He built it, he owns it." Tommy grinned at me across the conference table. "I think we should license it, but only to companies that treat their employees fairly. Grandpa Bob always says that success means lifting others up, not stepping on them." The meeting concluded with handshakes and business cards, the kind of relationship building that had sustained Brennan Construction for 4 decades. But as the clients filed out, I noticed something different in their expressions. They weren't just impressed by our work, they were impressed by our story, by the idea that a company could survive betrayal and emerge stronger. The media attention had eventually attracted the kind of positive notice that money couldn't buy. Brennan Construction had become synonymous with integrity, with the refusal to be defeated by family betrayal or corporate greed. We'd grown from 237 employees to 312, expanded into 3 new markets, and established a reputation as the kind of company that honored its commitments. But the most important change wasn't visible in balance sheets or employee counts. It was visible in the relationships I'd rebuilt, the trust I'd restored, and the legacy I was creating, not just for Tommy, but for everyone who'd remained loyal during the darkest period of my life. Janet Morrison had become our chief financial officer, bringing the same forensic skills that had exposed David's conspiracy to the task of ensuring it never happened again. Every financial decision required dual approval. Every contract was reviewed by independent counsel, and every family member who wanted to work for the company had to prove their competence before they could prove their loyalty. Agent Chen had left the FBI and started a consulting firm specializing in corporate fraud prevention. She'd hired me as an advisor, helping other family business owners recognize the warning signs I'd missed. Together, we'd developed training programs for law enforcement, social services, and medical professionals who worked with elderly victims of financial abuse. Bob, she said during one of our monthly meetings, "You've probably prevented more elder abuse cases than any federal prosecution in history. The awareness you've created, the systems you've put in place, they're protecting people you'll never meet." It was satisfying work, but it couldn't fill the void left by David's betrayal. That wound would never fully heal, and I'd stopped expecting it to. Instead, I'd learned to carry the scar as a reminder of the difference between family and trust, between blood and loyalty, between the people who share your name and the people who share your values. Tommy had received letters from David sent from federal prison, and full of apologies that felt hollow and promises that felt meaningless. I'd read them first as his guardian, and each one reinforced my decision to protect Tommy from his father's attempts at manipulation. Grandpa Bob. Tommy asked one evening as we reviewed construction contracts in the office that had once been David's, "Do you miss him?" It was a question I'd asked myself countless times, usually late at night when the office was quiet and I was alone with memories of the boy David used to be. The son who'd worked summers on construction sites, who'd asked intelligent questions about project management, who'd seemed genuinely interested in carrying on the family legacy. "I miss who I thought he was," I said finally. "But I don't miss who he actually turned out to be." Tommy nodded, understanding the distinction in the way only children can completely and without judgment. "What about when he gets out of prison? Will he want to work here again?" He won't be welcome here," I said and meant it. "Some betrayals are permanent, Tommy. Some trust once broken can't be repaired. What if he changes? What if prison makes him a better person?" It was an optimistic question, the kind that reminded me why children were important. They still believed in redemption, in the possibility that people could fundamentally transform themselves. Then he'll have to prove it somewhere else to someone else. Our job isn't to fix people who've hurt us. Our job is to build something worth protecting from people who might hurt us again. 5 years after the conspiracy, I stood in the cemetery where my wife Linda was buried, placing flowers on her grave and telling her about the grandson she'd never met, and the son who'd betrayed everything she'd helped us build. The conversation was one-sided, but it felt necessary, a way of processing grief that had layers I was still discovering. Linda had died 3 years before David's arrest, succumbing to cancer that had taken her quickly and mercifully. I'd always been grateful that she hadn't lived to see her stepson's betrayal, hadn't had to choose between her husband and the boy she'd helped raise. But I wondered sometimes if her presence might have prevented David's descent into greed and entitlement. "You would have been proud of Tommy," I told her, headstone brushing leaves away from the engraved dates that marked her too short life. "He's got your sense of fairness and my stubborn streak. And he's building something new, something that honors what we created without being trapped by it." Tommy was 15 now, tall and serious and brilliant in ways that sometimes startled me. He worked part-time for Brennan Construction, not because he needed the money, but because he wanted to understand every aspect of the business before deciding whether to make it his life's work. "I might want to be an engineer," he'd told me recently. "Or maybe a computer programmer. Or maybe I'll run the company but change how construction works, make it more efficient, more sustainable." "You can be anything you want," I'd replied. "That's the point of building something, so the next generation has choices." The business had evolved beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd started with one truck and unlimited ambition. We now specialized in sustainable construction, using Tommy's technological innovations to reduce waste and improve efficiency. Our projects included affordable housing developments, solar installations, and retrofitting older buildings for environmental compliance. But more importantly, we'd become a model for family business succession planning. Harvard Business School had written a case study about our recovery from internal fraud. The Small Business Administration used our story to train entrepreneurs about corporate governance. I'd testified before Congress about the need for stronger elder abuse protections in family-owned companies. Mr. Brennan, the Congresswoman, had said during my testimony, "What would you tell other business owners who might be facing similar situations?" "Trust, but verify," I'd replied. "Love your family, but protect your life's work. And remember that the people who deserve your trust are the ones who encourage you to stay strong, not the ones who convince you that you're weak." The hearing had led to new federal legislation requiring additional oversight for power of attorney transfers involving business assets. It wouldn't prevent all elder abuse, but it would make schemes like David's harder to execute and easier to prosecute. On my 75th birthday, Tommy organized a surprise party in the Brennan Construction Conference Room. The same room where I'd been ambushed 7 years earlier, now transformed into a celebration of survival and success. The guest list included employees, clients, competitors who'd become friends, and law enforcement officers who'd helped me reclaim my life. Janet Morrison gave a toast that brought tears to my eyes. "To Bob Brennan," she said, raising her glass, "who proved that wisdom doesn't diminish with age, that trust is earned rather than inherited, and that the best revenge against betrayal is building something better than what was stolen." The party lasted until midnight, filled with stories about projects we'd completed, challenges we'd overcome, and dreams we were still pursuing. But the best moment came at the end when Tommy pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Grandpa Bob," he said, "I've decided what I want to do with my life. Tell me. I want to run Brennan Construction, but I want to do it differently. I want to use technology to make construction more efficient and more fair. I want to create jobs that pay well and treat people with respect. And I want to build things that last." I smiled, feeling the same pride I'd felt 47 years earlier when I'd completed my first major project, a small office building that was still standing, still serving its purpose, still proof that good work endures. "Then let's start planning," I said. "We've got a legacy to build." The company I'd nearly lost to greed and betrayal had become something larger than I'd ever imagined. Not just a business, but a foundation for the next generation's dreams. David had tried to steal it, but he'd only succeeded in proving that what we'd built was worth fighting for. Tommy wouldn't inherit Brennan Construction because of his blood relationship to me. He'd earn it through competence, integrity, and the understanding that true ownership comes from service rather than self-interest. And somewhere in a federal prison, David was learning the same lesson I'd tried to teach him 20 years too late. That shortcuts lead to dead ends, that betrayal comes with consequences, and that some mistakes are too big to undo. But those were his lessons to learn. Mine was simpler. At 75 years old, I was still building, still growing, still teaching the next generation that success isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you leave behind.